San Antonio has some awesome beer, and we can thank the German, Austrian, and Czech immigrants who settled in San Antonio and surrounding areas back in the mid-1800s.
I mean, Germans are thirsty people. They like their beer.
Charlie Statz is a self-proclaimed beer history nut.
I started collecting beer advertising when I was 13, and I'm now 58.
He used to work at the Pearl Brewery in the 1980s.
I just totally went off the deep end in collecting Pearl and really then getting into the history.
Charlie now has a huge collection of beer advertisements and memorabilia, some dating back to San Antonio's earliest days as a brewery town. He says back then, cost was an incentive for migrants to brew their own beer because most of it came from out of state.
Since it came so far, by the time it got here, it was also very expensive. So all the Germans knew, hey, we can make it better, we can make it cheaper. You know, we got great San Antonio water.
San Antonio's brewing history is believed to have all started here, the Menger Hotel.
In 1855, the first actual licensed commercial brewery opened, which means they had a manufacturer's license with the state of Texas, and it was a man named William Menger, a German immigrant.
Travis Poling is the co-author of San Antonio Beer, Alamo City History by the Pint. Menger's brewery didn't just distribute locally.
He distributed as far west as San Angelo, which back then was called Fort Concho, and as far east as Galveston, and then also down to the valley.
The hotel didn't exist just yet, but Menger's Western Brewery was so popular, customers often crashed there or at his wife's boarding house next door. So they quickly realized they needed to expand. The Menger Hotel opened in 1859.
It was 2 stories, but it opened as an immediate success, and then he transferred out of the beer business into the hotel business.
The brewery was moved to the tunnels underneath the hotel.
The address was in the 240 Blum Street range. So we're 204 Alamo Plaza. So if you think about the mall, River Center Mall, that runs along Blum Street. So the brewery had to be within a stone's throw of this hotel. And we know that there are underground passages that connected the brewery.
The tunnel served as fermentation and storage space for the grain, hops, and yeast, and the brewery's popularity continued to grow, including during the Civil War.
Here's the bar tab book for the Menger Hotel. It has both Union and Confederate officers drinking in the Menger bar.
Menger's brewery was in business until 1878. That year, it was considered one of the largest producers in Texas. During the 1870s, there were dozens of breweries operating in the greater San Antonio area. Some survived and some didn't, thanks to competition from beer giants Budweiser and Anheuser-Busch. One such example was William Esser's brewery. It opened up in 1874. 10 years later, beer magnate Adolphus Busch bought it and renamed it Lone Star.
It's now known as the San Antonio Museum of Art. That's the building. It was founded by, roughly around 9 local businessmen and one other. The one other happened to be Adolphus Busch.
Adolphus Busch hired Otto Kaler as a manager. Otto would later leave Lone Star and take over the Pearl. Lone Star, which was located on Jones Avenue, was the first large mechanized brewery in Texas. But it wasn't the only major player in the brewing industry. The Pearl Brewery got its start in 1883.
They reached a point where they were both pretty much neck and neck in production and also statewide distribution.
The Pearl was originally known as the San Antonio Brewing Association and by a few other names because back then there were a lot of brewery owners who would either sell or get bought out. It's a lot to keep track of. So back to the main story. The Pearl is named after its iconic beer. It was created in 1887, formulated and first brewed in Bremen, Germany. The beer got its name from the brewmaster, who thought the foamy bubbles in a freshly poured glass resembled sparkling pearls. By 1916, the Pearl was the largest brewery in Texas. While Prohibition forced Lone Star to close in 1919, the Pearl pivoted.
Otto Kaler's widow, Emma Kaler, kept it going by using their auto shop for repair people's cars. They were making sodas, Orange Crush sodas. They were making ice cream. They were making malt for malted milk. They were using every piece of the equipment that was part of the brewing process and part of maintaining a manufacturing facility to kind of keep this thing going during Prohibition. So they were the first brewery actually in the entire Southwest to reopen when Prohibition was lifted.
Despite reopening once Prohibition was lifted in 1933, Emma faced another challenge, the Great Depression.
They sold off the soda bottling portion of the brewery to a company who still operated it on the brewery grounds, and then they got back into making full-strength beer.
Emma managed to keep the brewery afloat by selling beer to those who could afford it. Around the same year, Sabinus Brewing was built on Lone Star Boulevard. It would later become home to the beer we all know as Lone Star.
It had a very large run and following. They even opened up a second location in Oklahoma City in the early 60s. Their sales never really exceeded Pearl's until the 1970s.
In 1952, the San Antonio Brewing Association officially became the Pearl Brewing Company because honestly, the name was confusing people. In the 1950s, Pearl was the #1 selling beer, but by 1968, it was at the bottom of that list because once again, the beer giants kept getting bigger. In 1985, Pabst Brewing Company took over the Pearl. It only survived for another 15 years, and the doors closed in 2001.